Go ahead, start it up.
Hi, everybody on Zoom. This is Denise at the Mahwah Public Library. Welcome to tonight's program that is via Zoom and also in person. We call it the hybrid version. Evan is also one of those people who records his program. So it will be available if you want to see it again, or you know someone who would want to see it and they missed it tonight. So thank you for joining us. We are having Sunday concerts. We are having yoga, both in person and via Zoom. We're having meditation on Zoom and in person. So you're welcome to join us. Look on mahwahlibrary.org and join us anytime. And if you don't get your Zoom link, give us a call. Everyone in the library has the Zoom link and they can pass it on to you, so you'd be able to join. Even if registration has closed, we can still get it to you. So I guess that's about all. I'm going to welcome back Evan, who tonight is going to be talking about early radio, which was actually my mother's favorite. She always called TB the stupid box. She loved radio her whole life. She actually used to work on radio, WIRE. When she was younger, before she married my dad. But anyway, so thank you and enjoy.
Television, the box with the wires that comes out of it. Anyway, thank you, Denise, and thank you out in Zoom land, and thank you for being here in person. I am going to take off my mask now because it's stifling and there's nobody in front of me, so that'll be okay. Radio. Well, radio started actually in Cornwall, UK, way back when, over 120 years ago. But anyway, the power of radio, when radio comes of age and how powerful radio is, well, might have been on October 30th, 1938. That was the night that Orson Welles and the Mercury Arts Theater decided to do a drama called The War of the Worlds. And this is a headline from the Chicago Herald Examiner: Radio Fake Scares Nation. And what Wells basically did was take this book here, hang on one second here, since I have to make sure that this works. What he did was take this book, War of the Worlds, which is probably in this library, by H.G. Wells, who, by the way, had books banned in Boston. Because if you were banned in Boston, that was allegedly a good thing. But anyway, War of the Worlds. This is an 1897 book, and Orson Welles takes it about 40 years later and makes a radio play out of it. Wells Mercury Theater on the air had been on CBS for 17 weeks at this point. It was a low-budget show, had no sponsor, but it had a small but loyal following. And what basically he did was take literary classics and make it his own on radio. He was also going up against the Edgar Bergen, Charlie McCarthy show, which at that point was an extremely popular radio show. So this is Wells, what he says: I had conceived the idea of doing a radio broadcast in such a manner that a crisis would actually seem to be happening. You know, one second here, I gotta allow Sharon in the room. Hello, Sharon, you haven't missed anything. We're just starting with Orson Welles right now. Anyway, here's the show. It's on CBS. There is Welles, and he's directing the actors, and the actors are just performing a play. Now, most people are listening to the Charlie McCarthy, Edgar Bergen, of course, being the ventriloquist, and Charlie McCarthy being the dummy. So they tune into the show halfway in, and they miss the opening disclaimer that, hey, this is just, all it is a radio drama show. It's nothing more. And the whole thing was that Wells puts this thing near Princeton, and the Martians are going to invade the Earth. I did this talk about 12, 13 years ago over in Nyack. And it was the first time I ever met anybody who was actually impacted by this. And he's telling me he's living in Princeton with his brothers and sisters and mother and father. And his father is listening to the show. And he says to the kids, Go out in the garage, grab anything you can, a rake, a shovel, because you're going to hit those Martians over the head because they're coming, because Grover's Mill is only about 12 miles away from Princeton, and he actually thought they were going to invade. So they stopped listening to the show. They go into the garage. It's dark anyway because of the time of night, and they're waiting for the Martians to come, and they're not the only ones. Wells and his Mercury Theater on the Air had performed the radio adaptation of the H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, converting the 40-year-old novel into fake news bulletins describing a Martian invasion of New Jersey, of all places. Why New Jersey? Who knows? But I guess it's close enough to New York or Philadelphia. And hey, look, it's by Princeton, and why not? Why not Grover Mills, New Jersey? So they're describing what's going on. And there are people listening to this at home. And they're calling their local police departments, their local civil defense departments, saying, hey, are we ready to go in case the Martians are coming? Now, wasn't many people who were listening to the show, but those who did actually believed it. Some listeners mistook the bulletins for the real thing, and they placed calls to the police, newspaper offices, and radio stations, and they were able to convince journalists that the show was causing a national hysteria. Afterwards, Wells said, hey, all it was a radio show. But he also knew one thing. It proved the power of radio. People were listening, and people took radio seriously. Radio was still a rather young medium at that point. The first commercial radio station went on in 1920. But Wells proved the point that everybody took, that radio was important. The first 2/3 of the show was presented as a series of simulated news bulletins, which sounded real to some. According to Radiolab, probably 12 million people were listening when Wells' broadcast came on the air, about 1 in every 12 in the United States, and they thought it was true. Some percentage of that 1 million people ran out of their homes. That constitutes a major freakout, according to Radiolab. It was on, and it was done because in a way that people believed it, because back in those days, there were a lot of stations that ran big band shows. For instance, WLW in Cincinnati, their girl singer was somebody by the name of Doris Day before she headed out west. And she was replaced by a woman by the name of Barbara Cameron. I know her son, David, he's on cruise ships. He's a singer. And she went out west and wrote the Looney Tunes show, but she replaced Doris Day. Every city had a big band show. Some of it, Cotton Club in New York, also the Apollo, Savoy Theater, other places, not Savoy in New York, but other places. So it was very believable. The Federal Communications investigated the show, found no laws were broken. What was broken? This was a dramatization. Networks did agree to be more cautious in programming in the future. And the broadcast helped Orson Welles land a contract with a Hollywood studio. And a couple years later would come out the movie Citizen Kane, which was about Randolph Hearst. Oh, who was he looking for? This guy, the Martian. The Martian, that's what they were looking for. Marvin the Martian. Ever notice Marvin the Martian didn't have a mouth? He could talk, but he didn't have a mouth. Anyway, goodbye. This is Orson Welles. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a character to assure you that War of the Worlds has no further significance than as a holiday offering, as it intended to be. The Mercury Theater's own radio version of dressing up in a sheet, jumping out of the bush and saying, boo. And that was it. That was it. Scared people all over the place. In the end, it was just a show. And down in central New Jersey, in Grover's Mill, they have an annual date night, Devil's Night, Hell Night, October 30th parade. And they commemorated the show. There's Wells, there are the Martians, there are the people huddling around the radio, scared as could be. Radio, after all, is the theater of the imagination. And people were imagining what was going on. Radio, the theater of the imagination. My background in radio is simple. I didn't start out too far from here. WRKL radio on Route 202 on the other side of the New Jersey border. I did a high school show when I was 15 years old, Spring Valley High School, other side of the border. And I was on WGRC radio in Nanuet, which was 1300 on the dial. And we had a 2-hour block every Sunday between noon and 2 in the afternoon. And I don't exactly recall what it was called. It might have been Remember Radio or Radio, the Theater of the Imagination. That was the first time I heard the old Jack Benny shows or Burns and Allen or The Shadow, What Evil Lurks in the Heart of Men. Only the Shadow knows that. Or Inner Sanctum or whatever other programming that we ran. And we ran that for about 2 years that I was there. And Benny was the anchor show, but we had a lot of shows that we did following the Benny show. They weren't all the same. So it was just a radio show. Shows you how powerful radio really was. I got involved in the early days of radio when I was 22 years old, listening to those old shows, because the first time I ever heard it, because there was no internet in 1978 that you could, or no app that you could go to old time radio. There are old time radio apps you could go to today and hear these old shows. There is an October 30th celebration in Grover's Mill, remembering a pre-Halloween non-event. It was a non-event, the radio show. When I started doing this talk about 20 years ago, and unfortunately the crowds have dwindled who actually remember the old shows, 25 years ago, actually. And I used to ask people about this picture. And I said, did you sit there and watch radio? Everybody said they did. We used to sit there and watch radio. I had a woman who was part of a group one day. And she raises her hand and I said, no need to raise your hand. Yep, say something, say something. By the way, if you're on Zoom, you can either unmute yourself or put something in the chat box and I'll try to answer it. And she said that she used to listen to Inner Sanctum with her sister. And I said, how was that? She said, we used to get into the room and we'd shut off the lights and we'd hold each other's hand and we would get scared. It was a scary thing. I said, so why'd you listen? We loved it. We loved it because we thought, you know, we dreamed about what was going on. So theater of the imagination, that girl probably is about 85 years old now. This is where radio starts, St. John's, Newfoundland. And Marconi was there. And this is the top of Signal Hill. And I do cruise ships or did cruise ships before COVID-19. And when you go into the port in St. John's, you look up and you see that little building, which used to be a hospital. And that's a historic site because that's where Marconi received the first radio signal on December 12th, 1901. Marconi replaced a receiver at Signal Hill, St. John's. That's probably the closest point between Europe and North America, only 2,100 miles between Cornwall and St. John's. They send the signal out, Marconi picks up the signal, and here we go, radio starts. That was the first transatlantic wireless transmission, Cornwall to St. John's. That's my radio. I don't listen to it anymore because it's got tubes. I don't know where to replace the tubes. Cortlandt Street in Lower Manhattan no longer exists. It's the World Trade Center site. That's a 1951 Grundig, complete with a short wave, so you could listen to Soviet radio if you wanted to do so back in those days, or Radio America, some sort of armed forces radio. There's FM on the dial, but FM was not developed at that point. And AM on the dial. It was mostly an AM world in the it was all an AM world in the 19 teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, going into the 60s. That radio still works, I think. I haven't tried it out in about 5 years. Halifax is where United States radio is born. It is April 14th, 1912, and David Sarnoff is in the right place at the right time to start the radio industry in the United States. Sarnoff managed the Marconi wireless station at the Wanamaker's department store. And again, when I have a crowd in front of me, particularly seniors, I ask, how many of you remember Wanamaker's? They all do. Ask young people, Wanamaker's, what's that? Anyway, so he's in the store where they have a wireless station. And that evening, the ocean liner, the Titanic, strikes an iceberg not far from Halifax and would sink. Let's take this in chat here. I could give you, okay, thank you. Send me that information. I'd appreciate that, Sharon. I would appreciate that. You could direct message me afterwards. Anyway, so Sarnoff, and let's get rid of that and show you the General David Sarnoff. So Sarnoff starts to think about what the future could be like, because he's sitting there and he is getting info. And he immediately, when he hears the ship's distressing signals, he gets on the airwaves and starts sending out shortwave info about who's alive, who's dead. And people are listening to the shortwave and says, hey, Sarnoff says, hey, wait a minute, somehow we could do this commercially. We could get people to listen, and we could do this as news. We could do a lot of things on the air. So the operators are tracking the rescue effort. Sarnoff went to his station at Wanamaker's, oversaw a crew of telegraphers for the next 3 days. They published the names and survivors of the Titanic tragedy. After 3 days at the Wanamaker's post, he traveled to Marconi Seagate Station on Coney Island and contacted the steamship Carpathia, which had picked up survivors from the Titanic returning to New York. He proceeded to compile the names of these passengers, forward the names to their families. That is the wireless station in Wanamaker's back in the day. In 1915 or 1916, Sarnoff wrote about something called the radio music box, and it's the radio music box memo. And he proposed the development of a commercially marketed radio receiver for use in the house. In 1919, RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, gets the Marconi radio station from the US Navy. Commercial radio starts in the United States on November 2nd, 1920 in Pittsburgh. Why Pittsburgh? Well, that is the home of the Westinghouse Laboratories. And the Westinghouse Laboratories, let somebody else in here. The Westinghouse Laboratories, they're working on both radio and TV. The first commercially licensed radio station, KDKA Pittsburgh, 1020 on the dial. And if it's dark, which you will be in about a half hour, you go outside, put on your radio, go to 1020, and KDKA will bounce right into your radio here in Mahwah, New Jersey. The first program, the Harding Cox presidential returns. The announcer is Leo Rosenberg, and he was not in front of any big board. I can guarantee you that. I once did a show with Steve Kornacki, who does the big board on MSNBC. Anyway, Rosenberg delivers the results starting at 6 o'clock about what happened in the 1920 election, and that is radio's first big event. But the event that puts radio over the top is this, the big fight in radio. It's in Jersey City. It's a place called Boyle's 30 Acres, and it features Jack Dempsey, who is a controversial character of his time. Dempsey did not serve in World War I. He was a polarizing figure, and a lot like Muhammad Ali in the 1960s. Ali's reason that he didn't want to go into the armed forces fight in Vietnam was simple. I have nothing against the Viet Cong. I'm a conscientious objector. Dempsey is a little more complicated because he is the sole supporter of his family, and he does not want to go into the military and never did. So there was a lot of like and dislike of Dempsey. David Sarnoff had it all figured out for RCA to sell radios. Had to have programming, music, sports, and news. Let me just pick up this chat here. Favorite shows included Command Performance and The Big Show. There you go. Anyway, getting back to David Sarnoff. So he arranges for the broadcast of the Jack Dempsey, George Carpenter fight. The Dempsey Carpentier fight or contest takes place July 2nd, 1921 at Boyle's 30 Acres in Jersey City. This is a big event. This is a huge, huge event. It is the first $1 million gate in boxing. 91,000 people go to this fight. And RCA, thanks to Sarnoff, arranged for live coverage of the match on KDKA in Pittsburgh, which was the only station on at the time. And its coverage went to the Mississippi, down to the Gulf of Mexico, to the East Coast, the Eastern Seaboard, up through Canada. So if you had a radio, or a radiola as it was called then, you could listen. And this would be the first national radio broadcast. And there is Dempsey. Dempsey would win a 4-round knockout over Carpentier, 12-round fight. But the big news was the radio broadcast on July 2nd, 1921. Radio worked. What was in the first fight ever on radio? This guy, this tough-looking guy is Johnny Ray. This is Pittsburgh, and they got some the old, well, I don't know if it's a green screen or not, but they have some screen there, so he could pose for a picture. But the photographer decided, let's show you who's holding up whatever it is, blanket or whatever. It was April 11th, 1921, the first fight and sports event. It's heard on KDKA in Pittsburgh, again, the George Westinghouse Laboratories. 10-round, no decision fight between Johnny Ray and Johnny Dundee at the Pittsburgh Motor Square Garden. Harold Arlen, whose grandson actually played Major League Baseball with San Diego in the late 1960s. Harold Arlen was the first baseball announcer. August 5th, 1921, first broadcast of a baseball game. Made over the Westinghouse station, KDKA again. Harold Arlen, the announcer of the Philadelphia Phillies, Pittsburgh Pirates contest. Warren G. Harding, President of the United States, first radio installed in the White House. See, there's something wrong with that picture because you didn't look into the speaker. You turned your head to listen to the speaker. Somebody probably thought it was a good idea for Harding to look into the speaker, which he did, which he totally did. On November 5th, 1921, Harding makes history when he sends a radio message over RCA's Radio Central Relay Network from the White House across the world. Acknowledgements of the message were received out in Riverhead, Long Island, facility from Australia, Japan, and 15 other countries. Harding installed the first radio in the White House, February 8th, 1922. 2 years later, Silent Cal, Calvin Coolidge, who allegedly didn't say much, and I heard this great story once from the one-time owner of the Cleveland Browns football team, Art Modell, about Coolidge. And he said that he heard this story from George Hallis, who visited the White House with the Chicago Bears during Coolidge's time. It was about some woman. And this woman said, I bet you that I'll bet you $5 I can make you say more than 5 words. And he looks at her and says, you lose. She gave him $5. Coolidge's address for Washington's birthday was heard on 42 stations from coast to coast. Sports a big deal in the early days of radio. The New York Giants, New York Yankees World Championship Series, the World Series is on WEAF in New York, carried nationally, probably because of that guy on the right or the left here, my right, your left, the Babe Ruth. By 1924, think of this in today's dollars. Multiply that 83 million figure by 20, and you get over $1.7 billion because the money's worth about maybe more than 20 times, maybe 25 times. By 1924, the box, the radio, or the radiola sold $83 million worth of units. by 1924. The first radio program broadcast from a presidential convention takes place June 10th, 1924, the Republican Convention in Cleveland, Ohio. Radio's big news story during the two-day convention, the nomination of Calvin Coolidge as the Republican presidential nominee. And there's Coolidge with his cool car, except the speaker is outside. Now, if you wanted to listen in the winter and you lived in the North or the Midwest, it might be a little problem because the window is shut. But anyway, he's got a speaker on the side of the car. The night before the 1924 election, Coolidge made history when the largest radio audience ever tuned in to the broadcast of his final campaign speech. Coolidge won the election. In March, Americans listened for the first time to their president take the oath of office on the radio. And just check out what we got going here in the chat. Okay, Donnie Brasco. Okay, probably you lose. Anyway, so the president takes the oath of office on radio. Boom, 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 Three Little Tones. Saturday Night Live, actually back in the 1970s, redid the Three Little Tones, complete with the words to the song, Three Little Tones, I Love You, is part of the Three Little Tones. And Garrett Morris did it during a sketch on Saturday, a sketch, not a sketch, that's Sketch Henderson, a sketch on Saturday Night Live, the whole song. And I have copies of the song as well, the Three Little Tones. NBC Red. There were two networks, NBC Red, NBC Blue, that start in 1926 with Sarnoff. NBC Red's a flagship network with the established shows or establishing shows at that point. So we're no established shows. And advertisers. And that could include radio plays, mysteries, adventures, detectives, serials, soap operas, quiz shows, variety, hours, talent shows. NBC Blue had the sustaining shows, sort of like cable TV News Now, news and public affairs programming. NBC Blue, that's supposed to be blue, but it doesn't look blue. Headlines, remote reporting, sidewalk interviews, also known as Man in the Street, Man on the Street, MOS, as we used to call it. Panel discussions, weather reports, farm reports. If you were from the New York area, and you grew up listening to WABC radio in the 1960s, at 3 in the morning, they did farm reports. And Charlie Greer, who had worked for them, who got knocked down to the 500-watt radio station here in Nanuet, WKQW, was talking to him one day later on, and I said, why'd you do farm reports? And he said, because our signal reached out to Illinois, out to Nebraska, and to make sure we kept our license and we're serving the community. At 3 o'clock in the morning, we used to do the commodities report and the livestock reports just to keep our license. That's Bill Paley, William Paley. He is the founder of the CBS radio network and TV network. And he starts with a radio station, WCAU, 1210 on the dial in Philadelphia. Paley invested in a relatively small radio market, Columbia Phonograph Broadcasting System. The Paleys would purchase WCAU. Paley became the president of Columbia Broadcasting on September 26, 1928, moved to New York City and signed up 49 radio stations for the CBS network. Who were the stars of the day? Well, the stars of the day included Ed Wynn and Rudy Valley, Kate Smith. Kate Smith, that show featured Abbott Costello and Who's on First. Merton Marge, Paul Whiteman, the jazz man, Seth Parker, Burns and Allen, radio stars of the day. And they included Gertrude Berg and Philip Loeb as the Goldbergs, which started in 1929. And Gertrude Berg was one of the first millionaires from radio starting in 1936. Jack Benny Show, Mary and Rochester, Toscanini. You want to listen to the Metropolitan Opera? Well, there you go, Toscanini. That probably is the second or third longest running radio show. Grand Old Opry started in 1929, but that's still on the air. It started in 1940 on TV. George Gershwin might pop up on Rudy Valley's Fleischman Yeast show, playing various forms of I Got Rhythm. Amos and Andy, the two white guys who played the black characters, started in 1927 on WGN. Radio in Chicago, they would eventually end up, or the show would eventually end up on TV in 1951 with a cast of African-American actors. And it was off the air within 2 years because the NAACP decided to boycott the show. They didn't like the way the characters were portrayed on TV. They organized a boycott of the sponsor Blatz, and Blatz Beer decided we're getting out of it, and CBS canceled the show. Burns and Allen, there's George Burns and Gracie Allen. Fred Allen, who once said of television that they call it a medium because it is extremely, it's a medium because it's very rarely done well. Babe Ruth there being interviewed, the big star, he and Jolson and Jack Dempsey and Rudolph Valentino and Lindbergh, some of the big stars of the 1920s. Kate Smith, who had the radio show, the big time radio show on CBS. Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, we talked about them at the outset here. And you had the radio shows like Irma Phillips created Guiding Light, the soap operas. Your hit parade, Lucky Strike, LMFOT. Lucky Strike means fine tobacco. Anyway, Lucky Strike, your hit parade, and the Grand Old Opry, which I mentioned before. Grand Old Opry, a weekly American country music stage concert show in Nashville, was founded on November 28th, 1925 by George D. Hay as a 1 hour radio barn dance on WSM. It ends up on NBC radio in 1939. I saw the Grand Old Opry in 2002. I didn't know what to expect. It was great. I had a great time. Porter Wagner was the MC. LSMFT, Lucky Strike means fine tobacco. LSMFT, so round, so firm, so fully packed. Anyway, and big bands. Big bands were all over the place. Now, if you go to Glen Island in New Rochelle, there was a casino there once where you could hear Jimmy Dorsey or Glenn Miller or Tommy Dorsey. And those big bands were on NBC radio. This is all that survives of the big band there. Just a reminder that in the 1940s, you could see a radio show that was coming out of New Rochelle. And there's Gertrude Berg with her 20,000 scripts. She did 20,000 scripts of the Goldbergs on radio, TV, and movies. Gertrude Berg was an early star, born in Tilly Elderstein in New York. Her father ran a resort, the Catskill Mountains, where Tilly worked, and eventually created and performed skits to amuse the guest children. She might have been the first tumor. I know the last tumor. Crazy Tyrone spoke up at Kutcher's in 2006. He tried to get in my way, but he didn't. For those of you who don't know what a tumor is, it was a guy that would run behind you and would go, ah! And hoping that you would jump up. Hope I didn't break any microphones there or any computers. So Crazy Tyrone is now in Florida, presumably retired. Anyway, Gertrude Berg, she meets an older English man by the name of Louis Berg one day at the resort. Eventually, they would get married when she was 18. She'd moved to New Orleans. He was an engineer on a sugar plantation. A fire burnt it down. So she moves back to New York, pursues a writing career and an acting career, changes her name to Gertrude Berg, taking her husband's last name. She begins to write radio scripts about a fictional family, the Goldbergs, Jewish immigrants assimilating to the United States. She came from the Lower East Side, and that's where she got most of her stories. The Goldbergs, combination of her mother's maiden name and her husband's last name. There she is. The Goldbergs premiere in 1929. She is Molly until she could find another actress. She was so good that when she was sick for a week, the public sent in mass amounts of fan mail asking, "Where's Molly?" Well, there's Molly in 1936. She signs a 5-year, $1 million contract with the sponsor, Procter & Gamble. By the end of the year, she's making, she's making $7,500 a week to produce, write, and star in her own radio series. During the height of her career in the 1930s, only Eleanor Roosevelt was more respected than Gertrude Burr. She wrote and performed an original sketch for NBC TV, W2XBS, 1940, experimental station. And then she thought about a live stage version of the Goldbergs. And she would get that on Broadway. The Goldbergs left radio in 1946. She did the stage show in 1948, and that convinced her we could do TV. The stage show lasted 5 months. CBS puts the TV show on 20 years after it starts on radio. Significant fanfare, critical acclaim. She wins the first Emmy in history as Best Actress. And the Goldbergs nominated for the Best Kinescope show. She had a line of clothing. Her housewife, she was the lead writer, star, producer of the Goldbergs. And this is the beginning of radio shows jumping over to TV. TV did kill this radio star. She published a cookbook, wrote an advice column called Mama's Talks. The television show made into a movie called Molly by Paramount Pictures. Berg's on the set and in the editing room. She was the screenwriter and producer as well, but she's blackballed during the McCarthy years because she supported her TV and radio co-star Philip Loeb, who was accused of being a communist. The first radio guy who did news was this guy, Floyd Gibbons. He starts February 24th, 1930 on the Red Network. He was a newspaper correspondent at the beginning of the 20th century. Lowell Thomas lasted 4 decades. September 29th, 1930, he hosts his first radio news program on CBS. Before he's a radio commentator, you probably have his books in this library. He was a travel adventure writer, best known for his stories about Lawrence of Arabia. This guy was one of the longest guys ever to host a radio show. His name is Don McNeil. He was out of Chicago. It starts on the NBC Blue Network, then goes over to the ABC network, runs from June 23rd, 1933 through December 27th, 1968. 35 and a half years as host. It is the longest tenure of an MC for a network, particularly radio program, beating Bob Barker and Johnny Carson. He ran for president before Pat Paulson did, before Stephen Colbert did. He ran for president in 1948 on a Laugh Party ticket. Alex Trebek hosted Jeopardy for more than 37 years. The comedian Fred Allen, one of the stalwarts of the radio's golden age, talked about Mr. McNeil by saying he's a big, friendly fellow whose good nature pours through the microphones and listeners react in the same way anyone reacts meeting him in person. He and the other early settlers of radio established an intimacy that kept their audiences permanently loyal. The theater of the imagination. He's your friend. He is your friend on radio. You're with him 4 hours a day. It was generally a he. Fireside chats. Before there was Twitter, there were fireside chats on the radio. Starting in 1933, Franklin Roosevelt went right to the people. And he would inform people about his positions and actions taken by the US government with fireside chats. Edward R. Murrow, one of my heroes in journalism, because he said there was no equivalency, and he was absolutely right. There was no equivalency. You do a story and you don't have to get both sides. Absolutely correct. Anyway, Murrow, the Blitzkrieg in England, where he was stationed. With the words, "This is London," Edward R. Murrow brought the war in Europe to the living rooms of Americans. His rooftop reports to the Blitz helped define broadcast journalism. Murrow and his boys, he would actually have a girl too, Shirley Worsper in the 1950s, was married to Joe Wurshberg, except Bill Paley didn't know that they were married because there was a fraternization thing at CBS. And so she had to keep her maiden name to get paid. And everybody kept it a secret. I met Wurshberg a couple of times. Starting in 1939, Morrow's vivid reports explain the importance of the development in far-off countries, particularly during the Blitz, the German effort to bomb the British into submission. Morrow brought the violence and emotion of the war to American airwaves. John Charles Daly was the guy who you might remember as the host of What's My Line, but he was the guy who broke the news that Pearl Harbor was bombed to CBS, on CBS. It's December 7th, 1941. Radio news comes of age. Daly reports the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air. Roosevelt just announced. The attack was also made on all military and naval activities on the principal island of Oahu, not far from Waikiki Beach. And this was kind of the same thing as War of the Worlds. It was an opera on or classical music on, and Daly kept interrupting the broadcast. And that is the USS Arizona, which is, there's still oil seepage from the bombing, which is now 81 years, almost 81 years ago. Oh, Superman on radio. Look, up in the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane. No, it's Superman. And we all know that Superman has a weakness called kryptonite. But do we know why he has the real reason he has a weakness to kryptonite? Well, it had a lot to do with somebody wanting to go on vacation. Superman began as one of several anthology features in the national periodical publications Comic Book Action Comics #1, June 1938. National launched the Superman comic book in 1939. Starts on radio on WOR, which just recently celebrated its 100th birthday, on February 12th, 1940. Mutual, I worked at Mutual in the 1980s. Aired it nationally from August 31st, 1942 to February 14th, 1949. Oh, Superman. Well, what's the problem here? Superman has superpowers on Earth because our sun, Krypton's sun was red, our sun is yellow. Kryptonite blocks these superpowers and its radiation is poisonous. Kryptonians, which could kill them. Well, we don't know that. It's all made up. But the writers needed a storyline because the voice of Superman needs a vacation. Bud Collyer. Bud Collyer is a lawyer by trade, but decides, no, my sister is an actress. I could be a voice actor. And he's hustling around New York and he's landing all kind of gigs. He's never identified as the host of Superman or the voice of Superman or Clark Kent, but he wants a vacation. And so in an effort to give Bud Collyer some time off, a man much in need of a vacation, the writers of the show invented kryptonite, 1943, in order to make Superman sick. What they needed was a storyline. Didn't matter if Clark Kent was in there, but mattered that Superman was there. But if Superman is sick, all you have to do is get an actor to go, okay, Bud, you go on vacation, we figured it all out. Well, they did. This allowed the voice of Superman to be absent without ruining the regular broadcasting schedule. In an age of no reruns, and as one of radio's most popular shows, it was especially important to remain on air without interruption. And the sick Superman allowed that to happen, and he was able to get some bed rest. In 1949, in Superman 61, the comic, that's when the first featured on-paper appearance of kryptonite takes place. The stars, Al Jolson, Jack Benny, Eddie Cantor, Bing Crosby. Bugs Bunny is on the bench with all these never was's and has-beens when Elmer Fudd discovers him in What's Up, Doc. The stars of the show included Abbott Costello, Fred Allen, Victor Borger, Jimmy Durante, Phil Harris, Bob Hope, Amos and Andy, who were some of the shows. Burns and Allen, Fibber McGee and Molly, the Goldbergs, the Great Gildersleeves, You Bet Your Life started on radio. Blondie, Dick Tracy, Gasoline Alley, The Gumps, Little Abner, Little Off and Annie, Popeye the Sailor. The Abbott and Costello routine, Who's On First, premiered in March 1938 on The Kate Smith Show. Oh, and there were secret decoders too, Ovaltine sponsored shows. You sent away for your secret decoder, whether it was Captain Midnight's Secret Squadron. You know, you play around, they'll give you the clues, they'll give you the clues, they'll give you the clues, and eventually you get the answer. The Little Orphan Annie Decoder 1 was a fully functional hand-operated cipher disc shaped as a wearable badge, released in 1936 as a child toy, part of a successful commercial sales promotion for Ovaltine, the milk supplement, which tasted, in my mind, brutal. Ovaltine also sponsored Captain Midnight and other shows. Oh, by the way, the code when you solved it was drink Ovaltine. This guy had a sad ending to his life. This is the Yonkers Library. The Yonkers Library has the Yonkers Hall of Fame. You see people like Ella Fitzgerald in there, and because she lived there, and Sid Caesar, because he was born there. Joe Lapchick, because the basketball coach, he was born there. This guy, Edwin Armstrong, seeking to kill FM radio, which Armstrong invented before he could threaten his profits, David Sarnoff's company successfully lobbied the FCC to have the FM spectrum that Armstrong developed from Armstrong's frequencies from 40 to 60 megahertz to 88 to 108 megahertz. Radio stays the same on AM because of Sarnoff. Armstrong plan goes awry. He has FM on there, and he has a network. And Sarnoff's word that the network is going to kill him. So the move, frequencies, on June 27th, 1945, renders Armstrong's Yankee network obsolete, along with every FM radio set that had been produced through that. Armstrong was consumed by his work, and ultimately it destroyed him. Patent litigation and battles with government regulators operating in collusion with Sarnoff and RCA to derail FM radio sapped his energy. Armstrong committed suicide, jumped out of a building in Midtown Manhattan hotel, but his innovations remain the core of radio technology today. TV kills radio. There's the Dumont network. Television begins to make inroads in 1946. CBS and NBC have TV stations. Dumont starts a TV network. Radio is on the verge of being pushed aside. Did television kill the radio star? Well, yeah, it did. Although she thrived in radio. That, of course, is Lucille Ball. My Favorite Husband was first broadcast as a one-time special on CBS Radio, July 5th, 1948. CBS's new series, Our Miss Brooks, had been delayed coming to the air, so to fill a gap that week, CBS aired the audition program of My Favorite Husband. Lucille Ball and Lee Bowman played the characters of Liz and George Cugat, and a positive response to this broadcast convinced CBS to launch My Favorite Husband as a series. Bowman was not available to do the series, so when it debuted that month, it starred Lucille Ball and Richard Denning as the leads. The permanent show changed the name to Cooper from Cugat. It was Xavier Cugat who actually discovered Desi Arnaz. Little trivia there. My Favorite Husband, the TV show. It featured Lucy with Richard Denning. The show was written by Jess Oppenheimer, Madeline Pugh, and Bob Carroll Jr. The writers would be integral to Lucy's radio success, and that show would become I Love Lucy. 1950, CBS says, we want you on TV. She jumps at the chance. After all, that was her first real success, the radio show. So she jumps at the chance, and the rest is history. My Favorite Husband ends in 1951. Arthur Guthrie might have been the last radio star from 1945 to 72. Arthur Guthrie time was on Monday through Friday mornings, featured his monologues, his interviews, music, and regular vocalists. I got to know Julius LaRosa, who got fired allegedly from Guthrie. I got to know him WNEW radio when I was doing some stringing there, and he was a disc jockey, and he told me that Arthur didn't fire him. He quit, and that the handoff or the goodbye was bungled. By the way, Julie, who is one of the classiest people I ever met in my life, didn't have to talk to a 22-year-old like me, was the only celebrity who visited Arthur Guthrie on his deathbed. Talking information starts around 1953. That's Gene Rayburn, Monitor on NBC. Monitor makes its NBC radio debut June 12, 1955. Traditional radio, half hour, an hour comedy, drama, variety shows disappearing. TV has killed them. Radio's in desperate shape. Sylvester Pat Weaver, who created the Today and Tonight Show and Home on NBC, came up with a format so audacious and grandiose that nothing was ever heard on radio before like it. It's called talk radio. The end of an era, Jack Benny show with Mel Blanc. That's all, folks, Mr. Bugs Bunny. Goodbye, Jack Benny. May 22nd, 1955, the very last episode of the Jack Benny radio show features Mel Blanc as an interrupting sound effects man. The golden age is dead. A few would continue, but it was all over but the shouting. November 25th, 1960, there were still 4-time radio dramas. Young Dr. Malone, and for those who grew up in the New York area in the 60s and watched Sandy Becker on Channel 5, he first started out on Young Dr. Malone back in the 40s. Right to Happiness, the second Mrs. Burton and Ma Perkins, all broadcast on CBS, were canceled. Ellen Freed brings in rock and roll on WJW in Cleveland in 1951. Radio had to change to survive, so it's music. Top 40 radio, Elvis, rock and roll radio. Rock and roll was key to radio surviving because every city had 2 or 3 or 4 rock stations that teenagers with money to buy records and would listen to and buy products. Or American standards, Gershwin, Cole Porter, Irving Berlin, eventually there'd be FM. Transistor debut, which saved a lot of radio because kids bought the transistor. Debuts around 1955. Music suddenly became portable. No matter how isolated you were, you could hear the news of the world. Teenagers could listen to music anywhere they wanted, being as far away from adults' ears as possible. The transistor radio sparks a musical revolution, or helps sparks it, called rock and roll. Teenagers wanted their own music. Rock and roll, a teenage must, Billboard magazine, November 10th, 1956. Rock and roll is no longer a novelty. Its honeymoon period with the teenagers is over, and the reappraisal of its present appeal and future potential is taking place on the station management level. 79 of 179 managers participating in Billboard survey admitted that they had to continually increase the programming of rock and roll due to public opinion. Long live rock and roll. Long live rock and roll, but maybe not at the museum. That is a very disappointing museum. If you go to it, the Rock and Roll Museum in Cleveland, it's more of a Jan Wenner museum. How great was he, and less of a rock and roll museum. There's money to be made, though. Getting back to that article, the typical management attitude today is that a judicious amount of rock and roll time for peak teenage hours is obligatory. While there have been many complaints and alienations within other listening segments of the population because of the excess exposure of rock and roll, most analysts agree that the current music is here to stay. 1956 Chevy, the Henry Ford Museum, AM radios only. Radios started to, or rather cars started to have an FM band included with the AM band in cars in the late 50s. FM and rock and roll. Well, Suspense is one of the last of the old time radio shows that was on. September 30th, 1962, CBS aired a pair of shows that would conclude the golden age of radio. Yours truly and Johnny Dollar, Radio Suspense. Radio's outstanding theater of thrills said goodbye. It was over. AM stations have gone off the air in various markets, including WFAS in White Plains, New York. The AM band barely clings to life. A radio station used to be real estate. Not anymore. Most stations have little value. Yet radio could be reliable in a disaster. To bring you news like this kid who's 23 years old in Spark Hill, New York in May of 1979. This kid who's now talking to you now is interviewing Jack Kemp, who's running for president of the United States for the on the Republican ticket or for the Republican nomination in 1980. Used to be kids like me, used to get breaks. We used to interview the big people, which helped our skills. It doesn't happen anymore. TV did kill the radio star, and that's me way back when in 1971, when I did a high school talk show called Tiger Talk, which could be heard here in Mahwah, because WRKL Radio, Route 202, Mount Ivy, New York, is about, or the station, which is not doing the format did then, is only about 7 miles from here. So you can hear it very clearly, 910 on your radio dial. And the radio star eventually got on TV, being a pundit, Up with Steve on MSNBC. And thank you so much. Radio is not doing all that well, but you know what? People still listen to podcasts now, which means they still like the intimacy of somebody talking to you one-on-one as opposed to TV. Any questions, any comments? By the way, that's me in the upper picture interviewing Bob Hyland, who was with the New York Giants. Back in 1972, Spring Valley High School, where I was going, there was a charity game between the school teachers and the Giants. And I'm still trying to track down Bob Hyland, who lives in White Plains, so I could take a picture today with me and him 50 years later. But that was my first real interview. Anyway, thank you so much. Any questions and comments? Can we talk to you? Yeah, undo yourself. Let's see if I can. Yeah, go ahead. I hear you, Sharon.
Okay, you can hear me. Good. I have, first of all, thank you for the wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. I love this stuff totally, and have for a long time. I just wanted to share some resources with you that I think you might find useful. A friend of mine is starting. Well, actually has had